The gunshot that killed Samuel Hartwell in his Denver saloon on a bitter February night in 1879 had been meant for his business partner, but it was Cassandra Hartwell's finger on the trigger, and that was all the law cared about. She ran before the marshal could clap irons on her wrists, ran with nothing but the clothes on her back and her dead husband's horse, ran west toward the mountains where the snow fell thick and the law grew thin. The Rockies loomed before her like jagged teeth against a gray sky, and somewhere in those peaks was either salvation or death. At 23 years old, with wanted posters bearing her face spreading across Colorado territory like wildfire, Cassandra had stopped believing there was much difference between the two. The horse stumbled 3 days into the mountains, and she knew with a sinking certainty that the animal would not last another day. The trail had disappeared beneath 2 feet of fresh snow, and the wind cut through her wool coat like it was made of paper. She had been following what she hoped was a game trail, but everything looked the same now, white and endless and cold. Her fingers had gone numb hours ago, and she could no longer feel her toes in her boots. When the horse went down on its knees with a sound that was almost human, she slid from the saddle and stood there shaking, watching her last hope struggle to rise and fail. She was going to die out here. The thought came to her with strange clarity, almost peaceful. Better frozen in the mountains than dancing on the end of a rope in Denver, at least this way. Samuel's business partner would never get the satisfaction of watching her hang. She closed her eyes against the driving snow and waited. The sound of footsteps crunching through the snow made her eyes snap open. Through the white curtain of falling snow, a figure emerged, massive and dark against the pale landscape. For one terrified moment, she thought it was a bear, but then the shape resolved itself into a man, the largest man she had ever seen. He stood well over 6 feet tall, with shoulders that seemed to span half the trail. He wore a thick coat made of animal pelts, and his dark hair fell past his shoulders, dusted with snow. His face was hard-planed and weathered, with a thick beard covering his jaw, and his eyes, when they met hers, were the color of a summer sky, startling in their intensity. "You are going to die if you stay out here," he said, his voice a deep rumble that somehow cut through the wind. "Then I die," she said, too cold and tired to dissemble. "Better than what is waiting for me back east." He studied her for a long moment, those blue eyes taking in her exhausted horse, her inadequate clothing, the desperation that must have been written all over her face. "That horse needs shelter and rest, so do you. My cabin is a mile north." "I do not know you," she said, though even as the words left her mouth, she knew how foolish they were. She was alone in the wilderness with a dying horse and no supplies. Pride was a luxury she could no longer afford. "Name is Jacob Brennan," he said. "I have been living in these mountains for 6 years. I trap and hunt and keep to myself. You can trust me or you can freeze. It makes no difference to me either way, but I'm not leaving a woman and a horse to die when I have the means to help." There was no warmth in his words, but there was a kind of blunt honesty that made her believe him. She nodded, unable to speak past the chattering of her teeth. He moved past her to the horse, running his hands over the animal with a gentleness that seemed at odds with his massive frame. Then he bent, and in one smooth motion, he lifted the horse's head and shoulders, helping the animal to its feet with a strength that seemed inhuman. He took the reins and started walking, and Cassandra had no choice but to follow. The mile felt like 10. Her legs were lead, and every step was a battle against the wind and the cold and the exhaustion that pulled at her like quicksand. Twice she stumbled, and twice Jacob Brennan stopped and waited for her to rise, his expression unreadable. He did not offer to help her, and she was grateful for that small mercy. The last thing she needed was to be in debt to a stranger, even one who might be saving her life. The cabin appeared suddenly, a dark shape against the white mountainside. It was small but solid, built of thick logs chinked with mud and moss, with a stone chimney from which no smoke rose. Jacob led the horse to a lean-to beside the cabin, and Cassandra watched through snow-crusted eyelashes as he rubbed the animal down with handfuls of dry straw, then covered it with a heavy blanket. Only when the horse was settled did he turn to her. "Inside," he said, and she stumbled toward the cabin door. The interior was dim and cold, but it was shelter from the wind. Ease and that alone made it feel like paradise. Jacob moved past her to the fireplace, and within minutes he had a fire blazing, the light dancing across log walls hung with traps and pelts and the tools of survival. There was a bed in one corner, a table with 2 chairs, shelves lined with supplies, and a sense of Spartan order that spoke of a man who lived alone and liked it that way. "Sit," he said, gesturing to one of the chairs near the fire. "You need to warm up slowly, or you will do more harm than good." She sank into the chair, and for the first time in days, she felt the tight knot of fear in her chest loosen slightly. The fire was wonderful, the heat seeping into her frozen limbs with a painful intensity that made her gasp. Jacob disappeared into the lean-to and returned with her saddlebags, which he set beside her without comment. Then he moved to the stove and began preparing something in a pot, his movements efficient and practiced. "What were you running from?" he asked without turning around. She should have expected the question, but it still caught her off guard. "What makes you think I was running? No one comes into the mountains in winter unless they are running or hunting. You do not look like a hunter." He ladled something that smelled like heaven into a tin cup and brought it to her. "Drink this. It is venison broth. It will help." She took the cup with trembling hands and sipped carefully. The broth was rich and salty and perfect, and she had to fight the urge to gulp it down. "Thank you," she said quietly. He nodded and returned to the stove, pouring himself a cup. Then he leaned against the wall and watched her with those unsettling blue eyes. "You do not have to tell me," he said, "but if there is someone following you, I need to know. I do not want trouble showing up at my door." She owed him the truth, or at least some version of it. "My husband was killed 3 days ago in Denver. The law thinks I did it. I did not stay to convince them otherwise." Something shifted in his expression, though she could not have said what. "Did you? Kill him?" She met his gaze steadily. "Yes, but he was going to kill his business partner, and I could not let him do it. Samuel was not a good man. He beat me when he was drunk, and he was drunk most of the time. When I saw him raise that gun, I just reacted. I did not think. I just picked up the pistol on the bar, and I fired." She expected judgment, disgust, and perhaps even fear. Instead, Jacob just nodded slowly. "Self-defense," he said. "The law does not see it that way. His partner ran before he could testify to what happened. Samuel was well liked in Denver. I was just his wife. No one was going to believe me." "So you ran west?" "I heard there were places in the mountains where a person could disappear. I thought if I could just get far enough, I could start over somewhere else, use a different name. But I did not account for the snow, or the cold, or how hard it would be to travel alone." She laughed, a bitter sound. "I did not account for much of anything, really. I just ran." Jacob was quiet for a long moment, studying her over the rim of his cup. Finally, he said, "You can stay here until the weather clears. Then we will figure out what comes next." "Why would you help me?" The question came out more sharply than she intended. "You do not know me. I just told you I killed a man. For all you know, I'm lying about everything." "Maybe," he said, "but I have met enough men in my time to know the look of someone who has been beaten down by one. You have that look. And I have been alone in these mountains long enough to recognize desperation when I see it. You need help. I can give it. That is all there is to it." There was no pity in his voice, no condescension, and that was what broke through her defenses. She felt tears prick at her eyes, hot and unexpected, and she blinked them back furiously. She had not cried when Samuel hit her, had not cried when she pulled the trigger, had not cried when she fled into the wilderness. She was not going to start now. "Thank you," she said again, and this time the words carried the weight of everything she could not say. He nodded once, then turned back to the stove. "Finish the broth and get some rest. You can have the bed. I will sleep by the fire." She wanted to argue, but exhaustion was dragging at her like an anchor, and the bed looked impossibly inviting. She finished the broth, set the cup aside, and stumbled to the bed. She did not even remove her boots before she collapsed onto the rough wool blankets. The last thing she saw before sleep claimed her was Jacob Brennan sitting by the fire, his broad shoulders silhouetted against the flames, a silent guardian between her and the cold, dark world outside. When she woke, it was to the smell of coffee and bacon, and for one disoriented moment, She thought she was back in her childhood home before her father had died and left her with nothing but debts and a hastily arranged marriage to Samuel Hartwell. Then reality reasserted itself, and she sat up to find Jacob at the stove, cooking breakfast with the same efficient competence he seemed to bring to everything. "How long did I sleep?" she asked, her voice rough. 16 hours, he said without turning around. "You needed it. How do you feel?" She took inventory of herself. Her body ached in a dozen places, and her fingers and toes still tingled with the memory of cold, but the bone-deep exhaustion had receded. "Better," she said. "Thank you." He brought her a plate of bacon, beans, and something that might have been biscuits if she was feeling generous. She ate ravenously, too hungry to care about manners, and he watched her with what might have been amusement in his eyes. "Your horse will live," he said when she had finished, "but she needs rest. At least a week, maybe more. You pushed her too hard." Guilt twisted in her stomach. "I know. I just did not know what else to do. I had to get away." "I understand." He poured himself more coffee from a battered pot. "But you are safe here, at least for now. No one comes up this far in winter. Even the most determined lawman would not risk these trails until spring." "And in spring?" she asked quietly. "In spring we will figure something out." He said it with such certainty that she almost believed him. "For now, you rest and recover. I have work to do." Over the next week, Cassandra discovered that Jacob Brennan's version of work involved a level of physical labor that would have killed most men. He checked his trap lines every day, regardless of the weather, often bringing back rabbits, foxes, and once a beaver that he skinned and prepared with practiced efficiency. He chopped wood until they had a stack tall enough to last through several winters. He repaired the lean-to where her horse rested, reinforcing the walls against the wind. And he did it all with a quiet intensity that suggested he welcomed the hard work, as if it kept darker thoughts at bay. She helped where she could, cooking meals and mending his clothes and tending to the horse. It was strange, this domestic rhythm they fell into, stranger still because she found herself growing comfortable with it. Jacob was not a talkative man, but his silence was not oppressive. He seemed content to work alongside her without the need for constant conversation, and after years of Samuel's drunken tirades, the quiet was a relief. But she was aware of him in ways that had nothing to do with gratitude. She found herself noticing the way his muscles moved beneath his shirt when he chopped wood, the strength in his hands when he worked the pelts, the unexpected gentleness with which he treated the animals he trapped. He was, she realized with some surprise, a beautiful man in a rough, untamed way that matched the wilderness around them. And when he looked at her with those startling blue eyes, she felt something stir inside her that she had thought Samuel had beaten out of her long ago. One evening, as they sat by the fire after supper, Jacob said, "Tell me about yourself. Before Samuel, before Denver." She was surprised by the question. They had spoken little about personal things in the days since her arrival, keeping to practical matters and the rhythm of daily survival. "There's not much to tell," she said. "My father owned a small ranch outside Denver. He died when I was 20, and the debts he left behind were more than I could manage alone. Samuel offered to pay them off if I would marry him. It seemed like a good solution at the time. But it was not? No." She stared into the flames, watching them dance and flicker. He was kind at first, or at least not unkind, but the drinking got worse, and when he drank, he got mean. After the first time he hit me, I told myself it was a mistake, that he would change. But he never did. It just got worse. "Why did you not leave?" "Where would I have gone?" The question came out more bitter than she intended. "I had no money, no family, no skills beyond cooking and mending, and Samuel made sure everyone in Denver knew I was his wife, his property. If I had tried to leave, he would have found me and brought me back, and then it would have been worse." Jacob was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was low and rough. "I am sorry that happened to you. No one deserves that." The simple kindness of the words brought tears to her eyes again, and this time she could not stop them. They rolled down her cheeks silently, and she wiped at them furiously, angry at herself for this weakness. But Jacob just rose and moved to sit beside her, and without a word, he pulled her against his chest. She stiffened at first, an old instinct screaming at her to pull away, but he did not tighten his grip or try to hold her there. He just offered comfort, his hand moving slowly up and down her back in a soothing rhythm, and gradually she relaxed into his warmth. "It's all right," he murmured against her hair. "You are safe here. I promise you that." She believed him, and that, more than anything, made her cry harder, great gulping sobs that shook her whole body. She cried for the girl she had been before Samuel, for the years she had lost to fear and pain, for the man she had killed and the life she had left behind. And through it all, Jacob held her, steady and strong and utterly patient, until the tears finally ran dry and she sagged against him, exhausted. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "Do not be." He pulled back enough to look at her, his calloused fingers wiping away the remaining tears with surprising gentleness. "You have been through hell. You are allowed to cry." She looked up at him, at this man who had saved her life and asked for nothing in return, who had shown her more kindness in a week than Samuel had in 3 years of marriage, and she felt something shift inside her. It was not love, not yet, but it was the first fragile seed of it, the recognition that perhaps not all men were like Samuel, that perhaps there was still room in her battered heart for something other than fear. "Thank you," she said, and this time the words encompassed everything he had done, everything he was. He nodded and released her, moving back to his place by the fire. But something had changed between them, some invisible barrier had come down, and she knew that whatever came next, they would face it together. The weeks passed and winter deepened its grip on the mountains. Snow fell almost daily, piling in drifts that came up to the cabin windows, and the temperature dropped so low that the water in the bucket froze solid overnight despite the fire. But inside the cabin, Cassandra found a kind of peace she had never known. She and Jacob fell into an easy partnership, working together to keep the cabin warm and their bellies full. And slowly, she began to heal. She learned his story in bits and pieces, doled out in the quiet moments between chores. He had been a soldier in the war, fighting for the Union in battles whose names she recognized from newspaper accounts. He had seen things that haunted him still, done things he refused to speak of. And when the war ended, or he had come west looking for somewhere he could be alone with his demons, the mountains had given him that, and in return he had given them his loyalty, learning their moods and their dangers, becoming as much a part of the wilderness as the elk and the eagles. "Do you ever get lonely?" she asked one day as they worked together to scrape a deer hide he had brought back from the trap lines. He considered the question seriously, his hands never pausing in their work. "Sometimes," he admitted, "but I would rather be lonely than be around people who do not understand." After the war, I tried to go back to civilization. I worked in a lumber camp for a while, then tried my hand at ranching. But everywhere I went, I felt like I was suffocating. People wanted to talk about the war like it was some grand adventure. Wanted to hear stories of glory and heroism. They did not want to hear about the blood and the screaming and the way your best friend looked when a cannonball took off his head. So I came up here, where the only expectations are the ones I set for myself. "Do you ever think about going back?" "No." The answer was immediate and definite. "This is my home now. These mountains, this cabin, this life. It is not easy, but it is honest. And after years of lies and death and politics, honest is all I want." She understood that. The life she had lived in Denver had been built on lies. The lie that Samuel was a respectable businessman. The lie that she was a contented wife. The lie that everything was fine behind the closed doors of their home. Here, with Jacob, there were no lies. Everything was stripped down to its bare essentials, survival and work, and the slow building of trust between two damaged souls. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Jacob said, "I've been thinking about your situation." She looked up from the shirt she was mending, her heart suddenly racing. She'd been trying not to think about the future, about what would happen when spring came and the trails opened up again. "What about it?" "You cannot go back to Denver," he said. "That much is clear. But you also cannot stay hidden forever. Eventually, someone will find you, or you will need supplies we cannot get up here. You need a new identity, a new life." "And how do I get that?" she asked, trying to keep the bitterness out of her voice. "I have no money, no papers, no way to prove I am anyone other than Cassandra Hartwell. Wanted for murder. You could marry me. The words hung in the air between them, shocking in their simplicity. She stared at him, unable to process what she had just heard. What? Marry me, he repeated, his blue eyes steady on hers. As my wife, you would have a new name, a new identity. Cassandra Hartwell would disappear, and in her place would be Cassandra Brennan, wife of a mountain man. No one up here would question it, and no one in Denver would think to look for you under a different name. That is insane, she said, her voice shaking. You do not want to marry me. You do not even know me. I know enough. He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his gaze intense. I know you are brave enough to run into a blizzard rather than face a noose. I know you are strong enough to survive out here despite having no experience. I know you work hard and do not complain and can cook a decent meal from whatever I bring in. And I know that you deserve a chance at a real life, not just hiding in a cabin waiting for the law to catch up with you. But marriage? She shook her head, trying to make sense of it. That's not something to enter into lightly. I'm not suggesting we marry for love, he said bluntly. I'm suggesting we marry for practical reasons. You need protection and a new identity. I could use a partner up here, someone to help with the work and keep the cabin running when I'm out on the trap lines. It would be a business arrangement, nothing more, unless you wanted it to be more. The last sentence was said quietly, almost hesitantly, and when she looked at him, she saw something in his eyes that made her breath catch. It was want, a raw and unguarded, quickly hidden behind his usual stoic expression. But she had seen it, and the knowledge that he desired her sent a thrill through her that was equal parts terrifying and exhilarating. I do not know what to say, she admitted. Say you will think about it, he said. We have time. Spring is still months away. But I want you to know that the offer is there, and it is genuine. I would be honored to call you my wife, Cassandra, in name or in truth. She nodded slowly, her mind spinning. Marriage to Jacob Brennan. It should have been unthinkable, a leap from one disaster into another. But as she looked at this man who had saved her life, who had shown her nothing but respect and kindness, who looked at her like she was something precious rather than something to be used, and she found that the idea was not as crazy as it should have been. In fact, it was starting to make a strange kind of sense. That night, lying in the bed while Jacob slept by the fire, Cassandra stared at the ceiling and thought about his proposal. A marriage of convenience, he had called it, a practical solution to a difficult problem. But was that all it would be? She thought about the way her heart sped up when he came through the door after checking the trap lines, the relief and joy she felt at seeing him safe. She thought about the way she found excuses to touch him, a hand on his arm when she passed him coffee, her fingers brushing his when they worked together on a pelt. She thought about the way she caught him watching her sometimes, his blue eyes dark with an emotion she was afraid to name. This was not just gratitude. Mata, she realized. Somewhere in the past few weeks she had started to fall for Jacob Brennan, and that terrified her more than any wanted poster ever could, because falling for him meant opening herself up to the possibility of being hurt again, and she was not sure she was strong enough to survive another man's cruelty. But Jacob was not Samuel. That truth was undeniable. Jacob had never raised his voice to her, never raised his hand, never made her feel small or worthless or afraid. He'd given her space and respect and the freedom to make her own choices. And his proposal had been exactly that, a proposal, not a demand. He had given her the power to say no, and that alone was a gift beyond measure. The next morning, she woke to find Jacob already up, preparing breakfast as usual. She watched him for a moment. This man who had become her whole world in the span of a few short weeks, and she made her decision. I will marry you, she said. He turned, surprise clear on his face. You will? Yes? She crossed to him, her heart pounding. Not just for the practical reasons, though those are sound, but because I trust you, Jacob, and because I think that maybe, given time, this could be more than just a business arrangement, if you are willing. Something blazed in his eyes, hot and fierce. I am willing, he said, his voice rough, more than willing. Cassandra, I know it is too soon, and I know you have been through hell, but I need you to know that I care about you. More than I should, probably, given how short a time we have known each other, but I do. And I would count myself the luckiest man in these mountains if you would agree to be my wife in truth, not just in name." She reached up and cupped his bearded face in her hands, feeling the rough scratch of his whiskers against her palms. "Then in truth it will be," she whispered, and she pulled him down to kiss her. The kiss was soft at first, tentative, both of them feeling their way through this new territory. But then Jacob made a low sound in his chest and wrapped his arms around her, pulling her against the solid warmth of his body, and the kiss deepened. It was nothing like the harsh, demanding kisses Samuel had forced on her. This was gentle and sweet and full of promise, and when they finally broke apart, both of them were breathing hard. "We should do this properly," Jacob said, his forehead resting against hers. "When the weather clears, we will go down to the nearest town and find a preacher. I want you to be my wife, in the eyes of God and the law, Cassandra. I want everyone to know you belong to me and I to you." "Yes," she said, and she kissed him again, sealing the promise. The weeks that followed were the happiest of Cassandra's life. She and Jacob were not yet married in law, but in every way that mattered, they were already husband and wife. They shared the bed now, and Jacob introduced her to the pleasures that could exist between a man and a woman when there was respect and care involved. He was gentle with her, always asking permission, always making sure she was comfortable, and under his patient tutelage, she discovered that her body was capable of feeling things she had never imagined. He worshipped her with his hands and his mouth and his body, and she learned to do the same for him, marveling at the way this powerful man trembled at her touch. But it was not just the physical intimacy that bound them together. It was the quiet moments of companionship, the laughter they shared over small things, the way they worked together like two halves of a whole. Jacob taught her to shoot, setting up targets in the clearing behind the cabin and guiding her hands until she could hit a mark at 20 paces. She taught him to read, something he had never properly learned, and the look of wonder on his face when he sounded out his first complete sentence made her heart ache with tenderness. They talked for hours by the fire, sharing their histories and their hopes, their fears and their dreams. Jacob told her about the farm he had grown up on in Ohio, about the parents he had lost to fever when he was 16, about the brother who had died beside him at Antietam. She told him about her mother, who had died giving birth to a stillborn son when Cassandra was 10, about her father's slow decline into debt and despair, about the loneliness of her marriage to Samuel. They laid bare their souls to each other, holding nothing back, and in the sharing, they healed. Winter began to loosen its grip as February turned into March. The days grew longer, the sun stronger, and the snow started to melt in earnest. Jacob began making preparations for the journey down the mountain, gathering pelts to trade and making a list of supplies they would need. And one morning, he announced that the trails were clear enough for travel. "Well, we will leave tomorrow," he said. "There's a town called Silver Creek about 2 days' ride from here. They have a preacher, and we can get married there. Then we will stock up on supplies and come back home." Home. The word filled her with warmth. This cabin, these mountains, this life with Jacob, it was home in a way Denver had never been. She nodded, excitement and nervousness warring in her chest. "Will it be safe? What if someone recognizes me?" "No one in Silver Creek will know you," Jacob said confidently. "It is a small mining town, mostly prospectors and gamblers. They are not the type to pay attention to wanted posters from Denver, and even if they were, you look different now than you did when you left. You have put on weight, your face is tanned from the sun, and you will be traveling as my woman. And no one will connect you to Cassandra Hartwell." She hoped he was right. The thought of being discovered, of being dragged back to Denver to hang, filled her with cold terror. But she trusted Jacob, and she wanted to be his wife in truth, with all the legal protections that would provide. So she nodded and began to pack. They left at dawn, riding down the mountain on sure-footed horses. Cassandra's mare had recovered fully from her ordeal, and she followed Jacob's big gelding with the easy confidence of an animal that knew its rider. The journey was long but beautiful, the mountains giving way to foothills and then to the rolling plains beyond. They camped the first night under the stars, and Jacob held her close in his bedroll, his body a warm shield against the chill night air. "Are you nervous?" he asked, his voice a rumble against her back. "Yes," she admitted, "but also excited. I never thought I would marry again, especially not for love. But here I am, About to pledge my life to a mountain man I've known for less than 2 months." "Is it too fast?" he asked, a hint of worry in his voice. "We can wait if you want. I do not want you to feel pressured." She rolled over to face him, her hand finding his in the darkness. "It is not too fast. I have learned more about you in these past weeks than I learned about Samuel in 3 years. I know your heart, Jacob Brennan, and I trust it. I want to be your wife." He kissed her then, deep and slow, and they made love under the stars with the mountains watching over them like silent guardians. Silver Creek was exactly as Jacob had described it. A rough mining town built around a single main street lined with saloons, supply stores, and a handful of businesses catering to the miners who worked the claims in the surrounding hills. They rode in at midday, and Cassandra kept her head down, her heart pounding with every step. But no one gave them a second glance. They were just another couple, dusty from the trail, here to conduct business and move on. Jacob led them to a small church at the end of the street, a whitewashed building that looked out of place among the ramshackle structures around it. A sign outside identified it as the Silver Creek Community Church, and Jacob helped her down from her horse with a gentleness that made her smile. "Ready?" he asked. "Ready?" she confirmed. The preacher was a thin man in his 50s with kind eyes and a warm smile. He listened to their request without judgment, then asked a few questions to satisfy himself that they were entering into the marriage freely and with clear minds. Satisfied, he agreed to perform the ceremony immediately. They stood before the simple altar, Jacob's hands warm and steady around hers, and spoke the vows that would bind them together for the rest of their lives. Jacob's voice was strong and sure as he promised to love and cherish her, to protect and provide for her in sickness and in health until death parted them. Her own voice shook with emotion as she made the same promises, meaning every word with a depth of feeling that surprised her. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Jacob pulled her into his arms and kissed her with a passion that made the preacher cough discreetly. But Cassandra did not care. She was married to Jacob Brennan, the man she loved, and nothing else mattered. They signed the marriage certificate, Jacob carefully writing his name in the blocky letters she had taught him, and Cassandra signed as Cassandra Brennan, her new identity now official and legal. The preacher gave them a copy of the certificate, shook their hands, and wished them a long and happy life together. Outside, Jacob lifted her onto her horse, then swung up onto his own. "There is one more thing we need to do," he said, and he led her to the general store. Inside, he bought her a ring, a simple band of gold that fit her finger perfectly. He slipped it on with a tenderness that brought tears to her eyes, and then he kissed her hand like she was something precious and rare. "Now it is complete," he said. "You are mine, and I am yours. And the whole world can know it." They stocked up on supplies, flour and sugar and coffee and all the things they would need to see them through the next few months. Jacob traded his pelts for a good price, and with the money, he bought fabric for a new dress for her, a length of soft blue calico that matched his eyes. She protested that it was too much, but he just smiled and said that his wife deserved beautiful things. They started back to the mountains the next morning, both of them eager to return to the sanctuary of the cabin. The journey back was easier, the weather mild and the trails clear, and they made good time. But on the second day, as they climbed into the foothills, Jacob suddenly reined in his horse and held up a hand for silence. "What is it?" Cassandra asked, her heart suddenly racing. "Riders," he said quietly. "Behind us, 3, maybe 4, moving fast." Fear gripped her. "Do you think they are following us?" "I do not know." His face was grim. "But we are not taking any chances. Come on." He spurred his horse forward, and she followed, the mare leaping into a gallop. They raced up the trail, the horse's hooves throwing up clods of dirt and snow, and behind them she could hear the sound of pursuit growing louder. Jacob led them off the main trail onto a narrow path that wound between towering pines, and they plunged into the forest, branches whipping at their faces. The path ended at a small clearing, and Jacob pulled up short, swinging down from his horse. "Get down and stay behind me," he ordered, pulling his rifle from its scabbard. She obeyed, her hands shaking as she slid from the saddle. A moment later, like 4 riders burst into the clearing, and her blood turned to ice. She recognized one of them, A man named Pike who had worked for Samuel, a vicious brute who had enjoyed intimidating Samuel's debtors. The others were strangers, hard-faced men with guns on their hips and no mercy in their eyes. "Well, well," Pike said, a nasty smile spreading across his face. "If it is not the pretty little widow Hartwell. We have been looking for you, sweetheart. You are wanted back in Denver. Dead or alive, the poster says, but I reckon they would prefer you alive so you can dance on the gallows proper." "She's not going anywhere with you," Jacob said, his voice flat and dangerous. The rifle in his hands was steady, aimed at Pike's chest. Pike laughed. "And who are you, mountain man, her protector? You might want to step aside before you get hurt." "This is my wife," Jacob said, "legally married as of yesterday, and I do not take kindly to men threatening my wife. So you have two choices. You can turn around and ride out of here, or you can try to take her and see what happens. But I promise you, if you choose the second option, not all of you are riding out of here alive." The clearing went silent. Pike's smile faded, and his eyes flickered to the rifle in Jacob's hands, then to the massive man holding it. Whatever he saw there made him hesitate. Then one of the other men, a lean man with a scar across his cheek, said, "There are 4 of us and 1 of you. We will take our chances." He reached for his gun, and everything happened at once. Jacob's rifle barked, and the scarred man went down with a cry, clutching his shoulder. The other 2 men drew their weapons, but Jacob had already dropped the rifle and pulled the pistol from his belt, firing twice in rapid succession. One man fell from his horse dead before he hit the ground. The other took a bullet in the leg and went down screaming. Pike had his gun out now, but before he could fire, Jacob was on him, moving with a speed that belied his size. He knocked the gun from Pike's hand with one massive fist, then followed up with a punch that sent Pike sprawling. Jacob stood over him, his pistol aimed at Pike's head, and when he spoke, his voice was cold as winter ice. "My wife has a new name now, Cassandra Brennan. And as far as anyone is concerned, Cassandra Hartwell died in the mountains this winter. If you or anyone else comes looking for her again, I will not be as merciful as I was today. Do you understand me?" Pike stared up at him, blood streaming from his nose, and nodded frantically. Yes, I understand." "Good." Jacob stepped back but kept the gun trained on Pike. "Now gather your men and get out of here. And when you get back to Denver, you tell them that Cassandra Hartwell is dead. You tell them you tracked her into the mountains, but she froze to death before you could reach her. You tell them whatever you need to tell them, but you make sure they stop looking. Because if anyone else comes after my wife, I will hunt down every single one of you and make you wish you had never been born." Pike scrambled to his feet, calling to his wounded companions. They managed to get the dead man across a horse, and then they were riding away, Pike casting one last fearful glance over his shoulder before disappearing into the trees. Jacob stood watching until the sound of hoofbeats faded, then he turned to Cassandra. She was shaking, her face pale, and he holstered his gun and crossed to her in 2 long strides. He pulled her into his arms and she clung to him, her fingers digging into his back. "It is all right," he murmured against her hair. "They are gone. You are safe." "You could have been killed," she said, her voice muffled against his chest. "There were 4 of them, Jacob. 4. "I told you I would protect you," he said simply, "and I meant it. No one is taking you from me, Cassandra. No one." She pulled back to look at him, and the fierce love she saw in his eyes took her breath away. "I love you," she said, the words spilling out before she could stop them. I know it is fast and I know it is crazy, but I love you, Jacob Brennan." A smile spread across his face, transforming it from hard and dangerous to tender and warm. "I love you too," he said. "From the moment I found you half frozen in the snow, I think I have been falling for you. You are the bravest, strongest woman I have ever met, and I am honored to call you my wife." He kissed her then, deep and claiming, and she kissed him back with all the love and gratitude and fierce joy in her heart. When they finally broke apart, they were both smiling. "Let us go home," Jacob said, and they mounted their horses and rode back into the mountains, leaving the past behind them. The months that followed were a time of deep contentment. Spring gave way to summer, and the mountains exploded with life. Wildflowers carpeted the meadows, and the streams ran high with snowmelt. Cassandra tended a small garden behind the cabin, coaxing vegetables from the rocky soil, and Jacob expanded the lean-to to accommodate a second horse and a milk cow he bought from a rancher in the valley below. They worked together, building the life they wanted, and they laughed together, finding joy in small things like a successful hunt or a particularly good batch of bread. And they loved each other with a passion that never seemed to diminish, coming together each night with a hunger that left them both breathless and satisfied. In July, Cassandra realized she was pregnant. She had suspected for a few weeks, the changes in her body subtle but unmistakable, and when she finally told Jacob, his reaction was everything she could have hoped for. He picked her up and spun her around, laughing with pure delight, then set her down carefully as if she were made of glass. "A baby," he said, wonder in his voice. "We are going to have a baby." "Are you happy?" she asked, though the answer was written all over his face. "Happy does not begin to cover it," he said. "Cassandra, you have given me everything I never knew I wanted. A wife, a home, and now a child. I am the luckiest man alive." He placed his hand on her still flat stomach, his expression so tender it made her heart ache. "I promise you," he said softly, "I will be a good father. I will protect this child, and I will teach them to be strong and kind and brave, just like their mother." Tears streamed down her face, but they were tears of joy. "I know you will," she whispered. "You are already the best man I have ever known." The pregnancy progressed without complications, and as Cassandra's belly grew, Jacob became even more protective, insisting she rest more and let him take on the heavier chores. She protested, but secretly she loved the way he fussed over her, bringing her wildflowers and rubbing her aching feet after a long day. In February, a year after she had stumbled into Jacob's life, half frozen and desperate, Cassandra gave birth to a son. The labor was long and difficult, and there were moments when she thought she might not survive it. But Jacob was with her the whole time, holding her hand and murmuring encouragement, and when the baby finally came, red-faced and squalling, she felt a surge of love so powerful it was almost painful. "A boy," Jacob said, his voice choked with emotion. He cradled the baby in his massive hands with a gentleness that made her cry all over again. "He is perfect, Cassandra, just like his mother." They named him Thomas after Jacob's brother who had died in the war, and he was the light of their lives. Jacob was a devoted father, doting on the baby with a tenderness that surprised even Cassandra. He carved toys for him, sang to him in a deep rumbling voice, and walked the floor with him in the middle of the night when he cried, insisting that Cassandra rest and recover. As Thomas grew, they watched him with pride and wonder. He had Jacob's blue eyes and Cassandra's dark hair, and he was already showing signs of his father's strength and his mother's determination. The cabin rang with his laughter, and the mountains echoed with the sounds of a happy family. 2 years later, Cassandra gave birth to a daughter, a tiny thing with blonde curls and a smile that could melt the hardest heart. They named her Sarah, and she was as different from Thomas as night from day. Where he was loud and adventurous, she was quiet and thoughtful, content to sit on her mother's lap and watch the world go by with solemn eyes. Jacob loved both his children fiercely, and Cassandra often found herself watching them together, her heart full to bursting. This was the life she had never dared to dream of, a life filled with love and laughter and the simple joy of being together. The fear that had driven her into the mountains was a distant memory now, buried beneath years of happiness and security. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching Thomas and Sarah play in the clearing, Jacob reached over and took her hand. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked quietly. "Running into the mountains, ending up here with me?" She looked at him, this man who had saved her in every way that mattered, and she smiled. "Not for a single moment," she said. "You gave me a life I never thought I could have, Jacob. You gave me love and safety and a family. You gave me everything." "You gave me those things too," he said, lifting her hand to his lips and pressing a kiss to her knuckles. "I was just existing before you came into my life, surviving, but not really living. You changed that. You made me remember what it was like to hope, to dream, to love. You saved me just as much as I saved you." She leaned against his shoulder, watching their children play in the golden light of the setting sun, and she knew that he was right. They had saved each other, and two broken people finding wholeness in the wilderness. And whatever challenges the future might bring, they would face them together, bound by love and forged in the fires of survival. The years passed, marked by the changing seasons and the milestones of their children's lives. Thomas grew tall and strong, learning to hunt and trap alongside his father, and Sarah developed a love for reading, devouring every book Jacob could trade for in Silver Creek. They added two more children to their family, another son they named Daniel, and a second daughter they named Emma, and the cabin grew crowded and loud and full of life. Jacob built additions to the cabin, expanding it room by room until it was no longer the small shelter it had once been, but a proper home. He taught his sons the ways of the mountains, passing on the skills that had kept him alive all these years, and Cassandra taught her daughters to cook and sew and read, preparing them for whatever futures they might choose. In the evenings, after the children were asleep, Jacob and Cassandra would sit by the fire and talk about their days, sharing the small joys and challenges of raising a family in the wilderness. And sometimes, Jacob would pull her into his arms and dance with her to music only they could hear, moving slowly in the flickering firelight while the mountains stood guard around them. "Do you remember the day I found you?" Jacob asked one such evening, his arms around her waist as they swayed together. "Of course," she said, resting her head against his chest. "I was half dead and terrified, and you were the most intimidating man I had ever seen." He chuckled, the sound rumbling through his chest. "And now?" "Now you are the most wonderful man I have ever known," she said, tilting her head back to look at him. "My husband, my partner, the father of my children, and the love of my life. I will never stop being grateful that you ran west," he said softly, "that you ended up on my mountain, in my life. You are my greatest treasure, Cassandra Brennan." "And you are mine," she whispered, and she pulled him down for a kiss that was as sweet and tender as their first. As the years turned into decades, their love only deepened. They watched their children grow and start families of their own, Thomas marrying a girl from Silver Creek, and Sarah falling for a schoolteacher who came west to start a school in the growing town. Daniel became a rancher, settling in the valley below the mountains, and Emma surprised them all by becoming a doctor, traveling east to study medicine before returning to serve the communities that had raised her. Jacob's hair turned gray, then white, and his body grew stiff with age, but his eyes remained as blue and sharp as ever, and his love for Cassandra never wavered. She aged alongside him, her dark hair streaked with silver, her face lined with the evidence of a life well lived, and she loved him more with each passing year. They became legends in the mountains, the mountain man and his wife, who had carved out a life in the wilderness and raised a family against all odds. Young couples would sometimes make the long journey up to their cabin, seeking advice on love and marriage, and Jacob and Cassandra would welcome them, sharing their story and the wisdom they had gained over the years. "The secret," Jacob would always say, "is choosing each other every single day. Love is not just a feeling, it is a choice, an action, a commitment. There will be hard times, times when you wonder if you made a mistake. But if you keep choosing each other, if you keep working together and supporting each other, you can weather any storm." And Cassandra would add, "And never forget that you are partners, not master and servant, not owner and property, but true partners. Respect each other, trust each other, and never be afraid to be vulnerable with each other. That is where the real strength of a marriage lies." On a clear spring morning, when Cassandra was 72 and Jacob was 75, they sat together on the porch of the cabin, watching the sun rise over the mountains they had called home for more than 50 years. Jacob's hand was warm in hers, his grip still strong despite his age, and Cassandra marveled at the life they had built together. "I have been thinking," Jacob said, his voice thoughtful, "about that day I found you in the snow. Do you think it was fate? That you were meant to end up here with me?" Cassandra considered the question. "I do not know if I believe in fate," she said slowly, "but I believe in choices. I chose to run west. You chose to help me. We chose to trust each other, to marry, to build this life together. And every day since then, we have chosen to love each other. If that is fate, then it is a fate we created ourselves." Jacob smiled, that warm, tender smile that still made her heart skip a beat after all these years. "I like that," he said. We created our own fate, our own happy ending. Not an ending, she corrected gently. A beginning. Every day with you is a new beginning, Jacob, and I would not trade a single one of them for anything in the world. He leaned over and kissed her, soft and sweet, and she kissed him back, pouring all her love and gratitude into that simple gesture. When they parted, they sat in comfortable silence, watching the world wake up around them, and Cassandra knew that this was happiness, this simple moment of peace and love and togetherness. Their children and grandchildren visited often, filling the cabin with noise and laughter, and Jacob and Cassandra delighted in spoiling the little ones, telling them stories of the old days and teaching them the skills they would need to survive in the mountains. The family grew larger with each passing year, a sprawling network of Brennans who carried on the legacy that Jacob and Cassandra had begun. When Jacob was 78, he fell ill with a fever that refused to break. Cassandra nursed him day and night, refusing to leave his side, and their children gathered around, knowing that the end was near. But Jacob, stubborn as ever, fought his way back from the brink, and when the fever finally broke, he opened his eyes and smiled at Cassandra. "You are not getting rid of me that easily," he rasped, his voice weak but his spirit unbroken. "I should hope not," she said, tears streaming down her face. "I am not done with you yet, Jacob Brennan." He recovered slowly, and though he was never quite as strong as he had been before, he remained active and engaged, determined to squeeze every last drop of life out of the years he had left. Schreif. And Cassandra remained by his side, his constant companion and the love of his life. On their 60th wedding anniversary, their children threw them a celebration in Silver Creek, which had grown from a rough mining town into a thriving community. The whole town turned out to honor the couple who had become symbols of enduring love and resilience, and Jacob and Cassandra danced together under the stars, moving slowly to the music, while their family and friends looked on with tears in their eyes. 60 years, Jacob murmured against her hair, and I still feel like the luckiest man alive. Only 60? She teased. We're just getting started. He laughed, the sound rich and warm, and he held her closer. I love you, Cassandra, today, tomorrow, and forever. I love you too, she whispered. Not more than words can say. They lived 5 more years together, 5 precious years filled with love and laughter and the quiet contentment of a life well lived. And when Jacob finally passed away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 83, Cassandra held his hand and whispered her love one last time, knowing that he had heard her, that he had always heard her. She buried him on the mountainside overlooking the cabin with a simple marker that read, Jacob Brennan, beloved husband and father, who made sure the only one who found her was him. And she visited his grave every day, talking to him as if he were still there, telling him about the children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren who carried on his legacy. Cassandra lived another 7 years, surrounded by her family, and when her time finally came, she went peacefully, a smile on her face and Jacob's name on her lips. They buried her beside him on the mountain, and their children carved beneath her name the words, Cassandra Brennan, beloved wife and mother, who found her home in the wilderness and her heart in his arms. The cabin still stands on the mountainside, maintained by generations of Brennans who return each year to honor the memory of the man and woman who started it all. And sometimes, on clear spring mornings, people swear they can see 2 figures sitting on the porch, holding hands and watching the sunrise, their love as enduring as the mountains themselves. It was a love story that began with desperation and survival, but it became something far greater. A testament to the power of choice and trust and the willingness to open one's heart even after it has been broken. Jacob Brennan had saved Cassandra from death in the snow, but more than that, he had saved her from a life without love, without hope, without the knowledge that she deserved to be cherished and protected and valued. And she had saved him from a life of loneliness, from believing that he was too damaged to deserve happiness, from the cold isolation that had threatened to consume him. Together, they had built something beautiful in the wilderness, a family and a legacy that would endure long after they were gone. They had proven that love could flourish even in the harshest conditions, that two broken people could heal each other and create something whole and wonderful. And they had shown everyone who knew them that the greatest adventure was not conquering the wilderness or striking gold or making a fortune, but finding another soul who chose you every day, who stood by your side through every storm, who loved you not despite your flaws, but because of them. She was a wanted woman running west, and he was a mountain man who made sure the only one who found her was him. But in the finding, they discovered something neither of them had been looking for, something more precious than gold or freedom or safety. They discovered love, true and deep and lasting, and it made all the difference. Their story became legend in the mountains, passed down through generations as an example of what real love looked like. Young people would hear the tale of the fugitive bride and the mountain man who chose her, and they would understand that love was not always easy or convenient, but it was always worth fighting for. They would learn that the best relationships were built on mutual respect and trust, on partnership and equality, on the willingness to see each other truly and love what you saw. And sometimes, when the wind blew through the peaks and the snow fell softly on the cabin roof, people said you could still feel the love that Jacob and Cassandra had shared, warm and enduring, a light in the darkness that would never go out. It was a love that had transformed two lives, created a family, and left a mark on the wilderness that would never fade. In the end, that was their greatest legacy, not the cabin or the land or even the children they raised, but the proof that love could conquer anything, even the most desperate circumstances, even the darkest pasts. They had run from their demons and found each other, and in finding each other, they had found home. And that was the greatest treasure of all, worth more than all the gold in the mountains, more precious than freedom itself. It was the treasure of a love freely given and freely received, a love that chose and was chosen, a love that endured through all the seasons of life until the very end and beyond. Cassandra had been a wanted woman running west, but Jacob had made sure the only one who found her was him. And in that finding, they had both discovered the thing they needed most, the love that would carry them through all the days of their lives and into whatever lay beyond. And that love, forged in desperation and tempered by the harsh beauty of the mountains, became a beacon for all who came after. A reminder that no matter how dark the night or how cold the winter, love would always find a way. Love would always be enough. Love would always light the path home.